Let me say right away that I am absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to speak about Mr. Govind Pillai, and in association, of course, with this award, which has also delighted me. My deep and grateful thanks go to the committee for considering me to be worthy of this award. But my even greater thanks go to them for giving me this opportunity to remind myself and you of the conversations, the many conversations over the years that I had with Govind Pillai. We initially met because he was translating my book, The Past and Prejudice, which consisted of 3 lectures on Indian history that I had given on All India Radio in 1972. Please remember that was 50 years ago. We had just started the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and there was a great deal of interest in hearing what an academic from this new and different university had to say. But the one really long conversation I particularly remember was on my first visit to Kerala, when I was giving lectures at Calicut University, and decided to extend my stay and go down to Trivandrum and travel down to Kanyakumari and really get a feel of what Kerala was all about. I was taking the bus from Trivandrum to Kanyakumari, and to my pleasant surprise, who was on the bus but Govind Pillai? So we sat together and we talked and talked and talked, and that was really a great occasion. We drove through the coconut groves, and I commented on the beauty of the Kerala landscape, and every now and again we'd say, yes, but we have to say a little more about Gramsci and hegemony. And so the two things sort of went together. He was interested basically in assessing the degree to which colonial readings had been used in the ideology of nationalism. He had a special interest in nationalism and democracy. And some of us were arguing that Indian history had been incorrectly read by colonial historians, who defined India as a static, despotic society. We did not accept this, and we rejected this reading and said that we would write history afresh, which is in fact what we were doing, what a lot of the work at JNU has done since it was founded. The kind of history we wrote then were based on diverse sources, a multiplicity of sources, and used various theories of explanation to describe what had happened. In other words, we didn't have the usual single theory that it was a religious cause or it was a political cause. We said, let's explore, and we did a lot of exploring. This questioned the colonial readings, and incidentally also questioned those that Indian writers who were following the colonial readings, such as, of course, the preeminently the Hindutva writers, who were basing themselves entirely on the colonial readings. And the two-nation theory, for example, that was foundational to a communal interpretation of Indian history, grew out of this support that Hindutva history was giving to the colonial readings. This, as I just mentioned, was all happening half a century ago. We assumed that in this half century, colonial theories would be discarded, and we could move on to more challenging questions of history, which is what we were concerned with as historians. But we have now discovered in the last one decade that we did a U-turn, and we're back once again contesting colonial histories that are still being revived through Hindutva versions of history. So in a sense, we're back at the job once more. We obviously didn't do the job well enough for it to have been totally changing the historical landscape. My generation grew up on the cusp of independence. In 1947, this was welcomed enthusiastically, even if we as teenagers, as was just expressed by Mr. Baby, that we as teenagers were not absolutely clear about what independence meant. But we knew it was something good, and we knew we wanted it, and we would work it out the way we wanted it. We were deeply disturbed by the communal riots, the violence and the killings that accompanied these riots, but were absolutely enthused by the fact that the British colonial power had been thrown out of the country. And that's a very positive outcome of that movement. We were transiting from being a colony to becoming a nation state. And the two are, of course, entirely different. Make no mistake about that. The colonial state is totally different from the nation state. The nation state was demarcated territory where all the people living on this territory constituted one nation. They were not segregated communities. This coming together as a unity, which some called nationalism, was a foundational difference between the single nation and the earlier multiple kingdoms that had existed before colonial authority came along. How was the unity and the oneness of the nation to be maintained? The most significant way was to declare that the nation, unlike the earlier kingdoms, was to be secular and democratic. And this is what was declared in the politics of that time, very much so. I mean, if there were two terms that we were familiar with as growing up in school and college, it was secularism and democracy and the meaning of these. Allegiance was given to the system by which the nation was governed. And what was this? Some took their cue from the French Revolution and talked about the time that had come, which was a reiteration of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I remember we went around shouting these slogans, not quite absolutely clear about what they meant, but nevertheless they were important to us, to our well-being. And there were others who thought that focusing on the secular and the democratic was enough and was more effective. As in all ex-colonies, liberation from colonialism meant a new form of governance and taking a conscious decision of what this should be. This meant new structures of governance and new centers of authority. These were debated, discussed, and recorded in a constitution that would be the rule book of the new nation. The new nation would go according to the rules of the constitution. Power no longer lay in the hands of those who claimed to be born to it, but it had moved into the hands of those elected by the citizens of the state to positions that enable them to rule. And this shift in power is extremely important to the politics of post-colonial societies. Society was governed by those who were elected to rule. and adult franchise was therefore crucial. The values that were formulated in this historical change were founded on both secularism and democracy. The unit of society was the individual, the citizen, whose birthright was freedom. This again was a very, very significant change. Every single citizen of this country, everyone who called himself and herself an Indian, had freedom as their birthright. And this will also explain how much of a U-turn we have taken today. Secularism was not restricted merely to the coexistence of all religions, but required that no religion would control any civic functions of society, because civic functions were all the business of the state alone. The nation of India emerged in 1947, a fully independent state inhabited by free, liberated citizens. However, the creation of the other nation alongside, Pakistan, was opposed to both secularism and democracy. This opposition was also present in a couple of the Indian political organizations of these years, from the 20s onward. Alongside the main Indian nationalism, there had also grown from the 1920s, initially in a small way, two kinds of nationalism that had their roots in religious identities and not only in civil identities. That is, instead of nationalism having its roots in the liberation of civil society, it had its roots in the beginnings of the coming in of a religious majoritarian society. For them, the ultimate state would not be a state of equal citizens, but would be states in which religious identities had priority. And this provided a higher status to those citizens that followed the religion that was dominant in each state, namely the Muslims and the Hindus. Religious nationalisms create problems, as we all know today, since by definition they are neither secular nor democratic. Initially, India was projected as a democratic state, but was always having to contest the communal ideology which so slowly gained ground. The fallout of partition and subsequent communal politics was substantial. Nehru succeeded in making adult franchise universal. This was an achievement in defining citizenship. But the effort to democratize the civil code did not succeed. In the period after establishing the Constitution, we should have been focusing on the granting of citizenship rights. That's where our focus should have been. But we got trapped into the politics of communalism. And that is really a huge division that takes place that we haven't come to terms with. This was a major assault on democracy in India, since a dominant social inequality and the power of religious identity lay at the root of communalism. Pivotal to democracy is citizenship and the rights that go with it. These are far-reaching, but they bring democracy closer if they can be achieved. Every Indian is a citizen and a free citizen of equal status. It's very important to add that. Citizens should have rights to food, water, and shelter provided by the state. I'm speaking ideally of a society that we wanted to happen. Then come the rights to education and healthcare. And crucially important are the rights to social justice, equality, and the freedom of speech. To implement these rights are the government agencies through which the rights become functional, namely the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. In other words, the courts of law, parliament and the assemblies, and administration. It is only when this entire system functions satisfactorily that we can hope to see democracy working. And the interface of each of these facets from all these different institutions, one with the other, has to be a substantial reality. This is a very basic evaluation of democracy. Most countries do not have a full score, but some have a fairly decent score. We have some elements of this at some levels of society, but for the Indian majority, I'm speaking of the 50% plus of Indians below the poverty line, India is not a fully working democracy. We have a long way to go. The security of the minimum of food, water and shelter remains a complete dream for half the population. Even those that have these basics cannot be certain of having the freedom of self-expression, which is also an aspect of free citizenship. We are still hunting for a viable opposition to clinch the existence of a democracy. We don't have one yet. We don't have to go back to ancient Greece and ancient India and claim that we had democracies 2,000 years ago. This is anyway wishful thinking, because we didn't have democracies then. It's a lovely dream and fantasy that academics and politicians think up about how in ancient times there was complete freedom and there was democracy. Rubbish. Besides, what we need are democracies that suit our present-day societies. We don't go back to ancient India and ancient Greece. We stay with the present today and say, what is it that we want from a democratic India today? Every time we act in anti-democratic ways, it is the politics of social justice that suffer the maximum. I don't intend to go through the working of each of these aspects of democracy, freedom, social justice, but I will merely pick out a few strands that I think are crucial examples, which we go on quoting day after day, but about which nothing much seems to happen. The British imposed laws on us as a colony. As a democracy, we should have discarded these laws that curtailed our freedoms and gone in for laws that were completely different. But we didn't. The British laws remain. In colonial times, to question the actions of colonial authority was regarded as seditious. It continues to be so. It is the same with incarceration. A person can be arrested and put into jail and remain there without trial for any number of years, irrespective of what the accusation may be. 16 respectable professional people were arrested and jailed in the Bhima Koregaon case. One died. Some are now out on bail, a few, and the rest remain incarcerated. There has been no proper trial to justify these arrests, and one's really concerned about this because of the recent incident that happened where another person who was accused of being a Maoist and was jailed, after 10 long years he was acquitted and released. So the trial is very, very important. One doesn't really know what the result of the trial may be. He died soon after because of ailments that were not given attention to when he was under arrest. Others still languish, awaiting a trial. One may well ask, is this how democracy functions? If we describe ourselves as a democracy, these are not the activities that we should be indulging in. Providing a shelter is nobody's concern. This is only too well known by those who live on lands that are constantly submerged. Whenever the height of the Narmada Dam is raised, the land is submerged, people have to vacate the land and move to a higher elevation. Knowing that this will happen every few years, is there no way of locating elevated land that is such that it could be land where potential evacuees can safely settle? Surely it is possible to find such lands. Slum dwelling, for example, which we have all objected to in various ways, is now a recognized part of urban expansion. Every city that expands laterally also acquires slums. Again, had we really paid attention to that? To organize healthcare may be beyond the competence of most governments, but some minimum facilities can surely be provided. And then I come to education, which I have been writing about all my life. It should be a focus of democratic functioning. It's a much sadder story. It has among the lowest of budgets, and those who are competent to organize it purposefully in a proper way are generally the ones who are kept away from education. The people that move in to organize it are people who don't very often really know what we actually want from being educated. Education, which should be an adventure in the search for knowledge, is fast becoming a system by which knowledge is bypassed and kept away from those that most need it. When it comes to freedom of speech, the assertion of this freedom is problematic. One begins to turn to George Orwell's double-speak when searching for a way out. When the homes of scholars are raided and searched, and books are found there written by Marx, Mao, and Gramsci, the owner is not regarded as someone who is a widely read intellectual, but instead he is immediately denounced as a terrorist. State terrorism is often the function of the uneducated. We all know that a society which calls itself civilized has to practice ethical behavior. Did we once practice it? I don't know. Why was the Buddha always saying we need more ethics? And the Buddha goes on speaking about the need for dharma and karuna, ethics and compassion. And when somebody gets up and shouts, we need more of this, it means that there is a lack of this. And it is something that we should give very careful attention to. But these concerns about ethics and compassion and human concerns seem to be disappearing from our public speaking. There are only a few left that refer to these. Bringing them back will be a substantial effort. I don't intend to go through what is expected of democratic functioning. We all know that. We all know what is absent. We all know what is lacking. But as thoughtful human beings, can we make our society turn towards doing what will make us a fulfilled society and turn us away from the present impoverished form? Perhaps we should return to what we wanted when we first became a nation state. I'm now going back to 1940s, 1947. We should reiterate as clearly as possible what we want from our nation and insist that the state should function as fundamentally democratic. We have to go back to these beginnings again and go on insisting that that is what is important, that is what we really want and have wanted. If we acknowledge that the citizen is the pivot, then how do we ensure that the rights of the citizen are treated as foundational to our society? That seems to me to be a significant question. You may or may not agree. We need to remind ourselves, I think, of what we were striving for at that point when colonial rule ended. And in reiterating those ambitions even more strongly than before, we could attempt to build a truly democratic nation. And let me say in conclusion that perhaps we should start by rereading the writings of our earlier intellectuals such as Govind Pillai. Thank you.